This is Chad with Zone Offroad. I'm taking you through the install of our 1-inch leveling kit on this 2021 Ford Bronco. Now, this is the Outer Banks version without Sasquatch, but it also fits a Sasquatch version and also a Badlands version, which are all 3 different suspension types. First thing you want to do, remove your wheels and tires, put it up in the air so the full front suspension is drooped out. Then after that, we're going to take a 10mm socket and remove the ABS brake line from the knuckle and save the bolt. It'll be reused later. So the next thing you want to do is remove your sway bar link from either the control arm. The manual says to use hand tools on this, so don't use an impact, or an easier method is actually disconnect it from the frame. There's 2 bolts, there's actually a bolt and a nut here attached to a stud. So after that's done, what we're going to do next is we're going to disconnect the tie rod end from the steering knuckle, and that uses a 21mm socket. You see it's already dislodged, so it's a little bit easier to take out. So after you got the tie rod end disconnected, you can turn it and make it a little bit easier access to get to the upper ball joint. And this is an 18mm. You just hold that on there, then use a tool to remove the seated taper of the ball joint to the knuckle. You can have the knuckle rest away from the strut. Just be careful right now to not unseat the CV shaft. An easier method, what we can do next is actually disconnect the CV from the hub and then use an air hammer to drive it in. That'll just ensure that this joint doesn't come apart when we're trying to remove the strut. So we're going to remove the CV shaft from the hub. This is a 35mm socket. And next we're going to take an air hammer. If you don't have an air hammer, you can use a regular hammer with a chisel or punch to unseat it. Just make sure you don't mess up these threads at the end because they're very fine thread. So what this will do is, this will make sure that this joint doesn't come apart when you're trying to remove the strut. So next we're going to remove the strut, or to that, there's 2 bolts or 2 nuts down here. So we remove those first. And thread them back on a little bit. So in order to make it easier to remove the whole strut assembly, we're going to take an air hammer and knock these studs out of the strut. Again, if you don't have an air hammer, you can use a punch and a hammer to unseat them. This will make it just easier for disassembly. So now we're going to use an air ratchet. You can also use just a regular ratcheting ratchet or a regular ratchet to remove the upper 3 studs or nuts from the studs for the strut. It's best just to leave one on there just lightly attached so it doesn't just fall out. And now we're just going to remove the strut. There we go. Again, to remove the lower studs, it just makes it easier due to the thickness here. You got this ridge to try and fight it through. If you don't have access to an air hammer or punch, you can bring these out after and flip them over on a vise and then knock them out, because that's the next part of the installation, is there's actually a strut spacer that goes on the bottom and the top to actually provide your lift. So let's go do that now. So next we're going to install our Zone Offroad strut spacers. Now this is a 2-piece design. The one part goes on the top. There's an alignment pin there to line up. So it's a 2-piece design, so you don't have to rotate your strut top hat 180 degrees, which normally involves a strut compressor. Most people don't have one, so this makes it way easier. So you can only do this tall of a top spacer. That's due to the nut is only so tall, and then you'll run out of threads if you make the strut top spacer too much taller. From there, the rest of the lift comes from a lower strut spacer that goes under here. Now this can only be so tall as well due to the height restriction of the strut body to the CV shaft. If this is too tall, during turning of the knuckle will actually cause the CV shaft to rub into the strut and then cause a failure of your CV boot. So that's why we do a 2-piece design, compared to most people wouldn't probably go that route, but it's ease of installation and producing a better product. So with the top strut spacer on, we're going to install it the same way it was removed. Put it through the 3 holes and then use the provided nuts to just hold it on there. Next we're going to install our lower strut spacer, so it's radiused to match the profile of the control arm. It'll go in just like this. And then you can start your bolt on the bottom. And then with the help of an assistant, you can actually raise the lower control arm up to help with aligning the bolt. So now that we got the bolts through, just started, put the nuts on, and then go ahead and tighten those down. There's a 22 millimeter socket and wrench for these. All right, now we're going to tighten the upper 3 strut nuts. This is a 15 millimeter socket. So after that's done, push the upper ball joint back. Make sure that your CV joint didn't get overextended when you're doing this. You can have an assistant help you to pull the upper control arm down, or you can try and do it yourself. Get the nut started on there, and then we'll tighten that down. Again, this is an 18 millimeter. Next, we'll reinstall the CV axle nut. So next we're going to install our tie rod end back in the way it was. Put the nut on. Now again, this is a 21 millimeter socket. Tighten that down. Then after that, we'll come over to the ABS line, attach that back into the steering knuckle. And that is a 10 mil. So last we have to hook up the sway bar. And again, if you disconnected it from the control arms, use a hand wrench to tighten these down. There's an Allen underneath to tighten it with. Or like we did, we just removed the mounting bolts for the actual sway bar. And we're just using the stock hardware to put that back in. This is an 18 millimeter socket for these. So that concludes the installation of our Zone 1-inch leveling kit. Next thing we're going to go through and torque all the hardware that we loosened up to what the instruction sheets say.